What's up, guys? Welcome to Metal Vibes, and today we're going to be ranking the albums of the landmark extreme metal band
Sarcófago.
Sarcófago were formed in Brazil in 1985. The most notable early members from the band were Wagner Antichrist on vocals, who was actually Sepultura's original vocalist. You also had Gerald Incubus on bass, Butcher on guitar, and a gentleman named D.D. Crazy on drums, who would later drum for the band Sex Trash. These four would come together and produce the band's debut album, INRI, which was released in 1987. With INRI, it's almost hard to decide even where to start when talking about this album. It's probably one of the earliest examples of extreme metal and one of the most iconic extreme metal albums of all time. It's still so crazy this came out in 1987. If this came out in the mid-90s, it still would have been pretty extreme for its time. For 1987, you really had almost nothing that sounded like this. Maybe the first Volcano album, but even Possessed Seven Churches still felt more like thrash metal, whereas INRI just feels like a blend of black death and thrash. There's plenty of blast beats here, deep growling rasps, and again, guitar riffs that feel somewhat indebted to thrash, but really feel more extreme. Even aside from the extremity of this album, which I do love, the amateur charm of this album just really stands out to me on re-listen. I love the raw production, for example, and the drums, while they sound super fake, it kind of just adds to the old school trying to figure it out vibe that this record has. The vocals are often double tracked for even more extremity, and then I also love the Englishy lyrics that sometimes come up, like on the song Death Thrash with the iconic line, "If you are a false, don't entry." Everything about this record to me just sounds like a bunch of young metalheads pouring their hearts into a record and trying to make it as extreme as possible, and by and large, succeeding. All that being said, though, I think what really sets this album apart is just how memorable these songs are and just how good these riffs are. You have straight-ahead bangers like the opening track, Satanic Lust, which is just a black thrash barrage, complete with these notes that just sound like they're being skewered. But then you also have more dynamic songs like the track Nightmare, which kind of has this slow and doomy opening before exploding into these incendiary riffs, and then kind of reverting to some slower tempos later in its runtime. I also love the wild solo on this track and the shout of "Thrash!" Christ's Death is another really cool song with some belligerent riffing. I also really like the dirgy outro of this song, which kind of sounds like a classical musical piece that I can't put my finger on. That said, the way they add these layered screams to the outro just really adds a really cool effect. It almost sounds like a cemetery full of ghouls just howling at each other. The title track and Ready to Fuck are both really cool as well. They have these stormy and churning tremolo riffs that just sound awesome. I also like the little bit of atmosphere you get at the beginning of the title track with the thunderstorm sample. When it comes to this record, there are probably dozens, if not more, albums that took direct influence from it, and I love a lot of them, but I think what really sets INRI apart is just how much these songs really stand out and how much inspiration is here. This is the type of record where I feel like I could listen to it every day and it would never get old. Easily one of my favorite extreme metal albums of all time. I think it's one of the best out there. Easily goes to the top of the tier list. So following INRI, there would be some tumultuous changes with Sarcófago. Butcher and D.D. Crazy would both leave the band, and in their absence, Wagner and Gerald would record the Rotting EP, which was released in 1989. A lot of people seem to like this EP, and while it's definitely a step up in terms of musicianship, I just don't find the songwriting particularly engaging. It sounds really meandering to me, and just not as interesting as some of the other material the band would release. Soon, however, the band would welcome Fabio Jasco on guitar and Lucio Oliver on drums, and would release their second album, The Laws of Scourge, in 1991. The Laws of Scourge was definitely an interesting development for Sarcófago. It still kind of exists in that crawl space between death, black, and thrash metal, but it takes a much different approach than INRI by sounding a lot more polished and a lot more melodic. The production is a lot clearer on The Laws of Scourge, the guitar sound is a lot fuller, and I would say the musicianship is definitely a lot tighter and more professional as well. Wagner also kind of moved away from the deep rasps he used on the debut, and here kind of uses more of a gruff thrash approach, which I actually think fits pretty well. The other big difference with The Laws of Scourge is that the songwriting here feels a lot more complex and adventurous. I think you really hear that on the track Midnight Queen, which opens with some clean picking and synths, before incorporating some mid-tempo riffs and gang shouts, and even a section that's led by the bass guitar. Some of the vocals even have a depressive black metal kind of feel in this song. This is just a really great composition that almost feels a little bit progressive, and it really sounds nothing like anything from the debut. Fortunately, there are still some great, more extreme songs here, especially The Black Vomit, which is actually a re-recording of a demo track that was written before INRI. This song definitely sounds like it could have come from INRI, and while it definitely stands out as being the most aggressive thing here, I think it adds a nice shot of variety to this album. I will say too, even though the songs generally aren't as extreme here as they were in the debut, they're still really well written and packed with really great riffs. I especially love the title track on this album, which has some twirling intervals and then deeper vocals and tremolos. It just sounds like such an interesting development from what they were doing on the last album. Piercings is another cool song with some bouncy thrash riffs before getting more adventurous in terms of its composition. Then you even have some crunchy, groovy moments appearing on the song Screeches from the Silence, which also has this really awesome melodic riff that closes it out, and I love the way this riff harmonizes with some synths for a really cool effect. The closer, Secrets of the Windows, a neat track too. It has some doomy riffs. It almost gives me some Mystifier vibes, which is another really cool Brazilian band. Yeah, overall, I would say The Laws of Scourge just feels like a really big step forward in terms of production, songwriting, and musicianship. It is an excellent early extreme metal album. Not as groundbreaking as the debut, so I can't quite rank it as high, but it's really unique and is just a great overall listen. Almost the best Sarcófago album. If they had never released INRI, I still think they'd be a very notable band just for having put out The Laws of Scourge. So following The Laws of Scourge, we would have some more lineup changes with Fabio and Lucio leaving once again Wagner Antichrist and Gerald Incubus as the only members. These two would, however, welcome Eugenio on keyboards and release their third album, Hate, in 1994. Once again, Hate is a big departure from the last album. Most notably, you have programmed drums on this record, with Eugenio actually doing the drum programming. The drums here sound really artificial and almost give this album a little bit more of an industrial black metal vibe. I think you really hear that industrial influence coming in on the song The God's Feces, which almost sounds like Godflesh gone black metal, especially with its factory siren mid-tempo riff. At the same time, though, certain aspects of this album almost feel like a reversion from The Laws of Scourge back to the extremity of INRI. Wagner's vocals, for example, sound much more vicious than they did on The Laws of Scourge. Some of the songs sound more extreme as well, like the track Song for My Death, which is just a raging black metal blaster. Then you have the track Pact of Cum, which is very evil and malicious and almost gives me like early Mayhem vibes. The other big difference between Hate and the prior two albums is that Hate includes a lot of slower moments, and while you certainly had slower moments on the first two albums as well, Hate, I would say, is the first album where you have songs that are pretty much slow all the way through. Not all of them, but certainly some of them. Orgy of Flies is one example of a song like that. It's kind of neat. It kind of reminds me of early Mystifier. Anal Vomit is another song like that, and unlike the band Anal Vomit, which is very fast, this song is much more mid-tempo and slower, almost kind of reminding me of the Swiss band Samael. This slower stuff is okay on this record, but it does kind of drag a bit. The title track is something else I'm a little mixed about here. The lyrics to this song basically consist of I hate, and then fill in the blank with something. Part of me kind of likes it for calling back to the amateur charm of INRI, but part of me just thinks it's a little silly and lacking in substance. In terms of Hate as a whole, it's definitely more of a mixed bag than the first two albums. I definitely would have preferred more faster-paced material on it, and while the use of programmed drums is kind of neat, I still think I would have liked this album more if it did have a real drummer. That said, this certainly isn't a bad album. In fact, I actually kind of do enjoy it. It's definitely a step down from the last two, but it's something I'd be on the cusp of purchasing. If I got it as a gift, I certainly wouldn't sell it, but I don't know if it's something I'd pay full price for to get on vinyl. It is in the not actually that bad tier, I would say. Alright, so 2 years later, the band would release their fourth album, The Worst. Once again, we have programmed drums on this album and pretty heavy industrial vibes here as well. The big difference between The Worst and Hate is that The Worst definitely starts capitalizing more on the slower tempos that started really appearing more on Hate. A lot of these songs are definitely dominated by slower riffs, especially the title track, which kind of just drags along with this industrial shuffle and uses this repeated chanting vocal motif to kind of tie it all together. Slower songs aren't necessarily bad in principle, but I think the way they're executed on this album just doesn't really work that well. Some of these songs, for example, just feel way too long, with a couple of them even going over 6 minutes. It also doesn't help that a lot of them are quite repetitive, including the track God Bless the Whores. The other thing too is with these slower tempos and the programmed drums, you don't really get the atmosphere you would from like a doom metal album. Those industrial vibes just kind of suck away a lot of the atmosphere that you would have gotten. Fortunately, though, this album isn't all bad. I think things really pick up with the fifth song, Plunged in Blood, which sounds like a really black, thrashy attack. This song has some neat passages that kind of mix spoken word with this really fast groove that almost sounds like Meshuggah. I would say generally, too, when the tempos get faster on this album, you do have some decent ideas start coming in. Army of the Damned, for example, has a pretty catchy groove to it. Shave Your Head has some catchy riffs as well. Then you have the closing track, Purification Process, which is basically just a blasting black metal song, and is really not a bad way to end the record. That said, I would say even the best songs on The Worst are okay at best. As proof of that, the one song here that really stands out above the rest is a re-recording of Satanic Lust from the debut. Basically, as soon as this song starts, you can tell you're listening to something way better. But even then, this song just feels unnecessary. They didn't need to re-record this track, and I can't imagine ever listening to this version over the original. I will say the synths are kind of cool on this album, kind of calling to mind Samael or like an industrial version of Mystifier, only I find Mystifier a lot more interesting. This is a decent album at best. It's certainly not the worst record I've ever heard, but it's probably nothing I'd willingly listen to again, and it's definitely the worst of their discography. It goes in its rightfully named spot. So after The Worst, Sarcófago would release their Crust EP in 2000, which kind of had similar vibes going on and wasn't particularly great in my book. Later in 2000, the band would split up, and unlike other legacy acts that split up around that time, Sarcófago have never reformed, they've never released a new album, and really haven't even hinted at doing that, other than some rumors that were going around in 2009 about a reunion tour that never came to fruition. Apparently, Wagner earned his PhD and is now an economics professor at a Brazilian university, so presumably he probably doesn't have too much interest in reforming Sarcófago. But even if they never get back together, which I highly doubt they will, they've still left quite a legacy behind with one album that I consider one of the best extreme metal albums of all time, a fantastic early extreme metal album, a really good extreme metal album from '94, and another album that you could probably just skip. But yeah, that's my Sarcófago ranking. Let me know in the comments what you think of my ranking. Let me know how you would rank their albums. And as always, if you like this video, please drop me a like, please subscribe, and check out some of my other videos. But that'll do it for this one, guys. Thanks as always for tuning in, and I'll see you next week. Stay heavy.